Friends, welcome to the New South Wales State Election Candidates Forum for the Electorate of Sydney. My name is Sandy Grant and I serve here as the Dean of Sydney. Welcome to you who are watching on the live stream and thank you for tuning in. I'm going to begin by leading a prayer of acknowledgement. Our Lord and loving Heavenly Father, we acknowledge that you're the creator of all that is. And we acknowledge that in your providence you gave custodianship of the land upon which we meet to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge with sorrow the painful history between the Aboriginal people and the latest settlers of this land. And we pray that you may work between us the reconciliation that's the gift of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. I thank you for coming, and I thank our candidates present here tonight for their willingness to serve in public life and for their presence as a sign of willingness to speak to the churches. We have Mr Greenwich, the independent MP for Sydney, Ms Sky Tito, the candidate for the Australian Labor Party, and Mr Nick Ward, the candidate for the Australian Greens. If you do wish it during the evening, access to our toilets can be just found through the town hall door and to your left just before you exit. The format of the evening will be each candidate given 5 minutes to introduce themselves and outline their policy priorities. There are then 4 set questions that we determined were of interest to a variety of Christians, introduced with a brief video, and each candidate has up to 2 minutes to address the associated questions. And then questions from the floor, moderated through Slido, an online question system, and I intend to allow candidates 2 minutes per question there as well. At Choral Evensong just prior this evening, we featured some of Jesus' most famous words in answer to a question of whether it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, the Roman power occupying Judea, and he famously replied, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's." Christians believe the whole world belongs to God, and one day we'll give account to him for our lives, how we've loved him, how we've treated our neighbours. And thankfully, through the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, we Christians believe forgiveness is also available. But while the whole cosmos belongs to God, there is a proper arena for government. We pay taxes when we owe them to those who govern us for our safety and welfare. We render respect to those whom it's due, and I say including to those who give so much to serve us in public life and parliamentary service. That's why we're here tonight. And I will now lead a prayer for our candidates seeking to serve us. You might bow your heads. Almighty God, ruler of the nations, your word teaches us the hearts of kings are in your control and that you influence them according to your wisdom. We humbly ask you to direct the hearts of those who seek election to our state parliament. Grant to all who serve in public life wisdom and skill, imagination and energy. Protect them from corruption and the temptation of self-serving. Enable them to make realistic promises and help them keep their word. Preserve them from petty point scoring or foolish name calling. Thank you for our stable democracy and the good it offers us. So direct the election and then the work of those chosen to govern, that the decisions of our parliaments may work to the advancement of your glory and the safety and welfare of this country, so peace and happiness, truth and justice may be established among us. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I should say, I've said that we have our sitting independent MP, our Labor and Greens candidates, and certainly we invited the Liberal candidate for Sydney. To be fair, was only, I think, selected fairly late in the piece. However, she didn't respond to several attempts I made to contact her via different methods. Mr Greenwich has also advised he needs to leave by 7:30. If you just have a look at the Slido slide, I think that will come up. You take out your phone, you go to slido.com, type in the event number on the screen, 309 1184. We'll put that slide up again later. You can ask your own question by typing it in, or give a thumbs up if you see another question that you'd really like to be answered, and anonymous questions are fine. I'm going to sound a little bell off my phone sort of a minute before the time is up. Without further ado, perhaps, I hope it's not too old-fashioned to say ladies first. I hope that's okay. Would you please welcome Ms. Sky Tito, ALP candidate.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for inviting me here. And thank you for allowing me to be here on Cathedral land, and I acknowledge the traditional land owners of this land and any Aboriginal people here this evening, and any elders past, present or emerging. So I'm Sky Tito, I'm the New South Wales Labor candidate for Sydney. I'm 29, I'm a renter, and I've lived in Sydney for the most part of my 20s, and I've worked here for the past 10 years across public, private and not-for-profit sectors. So before becoming a political candidate, I was a communications officer at the New South Wales Department of Education and a COO at a not-for-profit called Raise Our Voice Australia. The reason why I decided to throw my hat in the ring is the same reason why I decided to move away from the private sector, and it was for education. In my personal opinion, I believe education is the silver bullet. I believe that education is what allows us to set ourselves up for success at any phase or at any stage of our lives. So I came into this campaign with education at the absolute forefront. The more conversations that I had and the more people that I met on the campaign trail across Sydney, but even irrespective across the state, my family live in southwest Sydney, housing became more of an issue. And then the way that I started to think about it is that it has to be a housing first mentality, because if we do not have access, or if the government does not provide access to safe, secure and affordable housing, we do not have the ability to plan for our education. We do not have the ability to plan for our future career. We do not have the ability to plan for a family or our future trajectory if we are focused on trying to find a home and just trying to find basic shelter, which is what it should be. So that is what I'm running the Labor campaign on for the electorate of Sydney. I want to bring the focus back to the basics. I want to focus on ensuring that our public systems, public housing, public hospitals, public everything works for the public. I want to ensure that we strengthen our healthcare system, our education system, and also our housing, because as I keep repeating myself, without access to safe, secure, affordable housing, we are unable to plan the rest of our lives. So thank you, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Sky, and we might extend you a little charity if you've got a longer answer to a question later on. It's wonderful when people keep to time. Mr. Nick Ward is the candidate for the Greens. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for having me, and thank you to everyone making the effort tonight to come along. And I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to note that this land hasn't been ceded, and I stand in solidarity as there is a continuing battle for truth, treaty and voice. And there's probably a few things that I would like you to know about me, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try and keep it fairly brief. One thing you probably need to know about me is that I actually trained in space engineering as a rocket scientist. Very handy when people say something that I want to go and respond saying that it's not rocket science. It's very useful for that, but not terribly useful in a lot of other formats. I have moved through, I guess, a bit of a corporate career since then, and I'm actually working now in education technology. So I'm working with a lot of faith-based schools, and I know the work that is being put in by those schools to deliver the best possible education they can to our children. And as Sky says, I think it's real. Education is terribly important in our community, and I see that firsthand. Another thing that is probably important about me is my background as an activist. So I began in the early 1990s in Queensland, leading the Queensland Association for Gay Law Reform, where we actually joined with a lot of the churches up in Queensland in fighting for reform of the state's laws criminalising homosexuality. And we were successful in that, happily, and I moved on to a lot of other campaigns as well. So I was involved in campaigns around violence, social welfare, and also social justice. And we had enormous success up there, as have a lot of the faith-based institutions here. Another thing that has been quite a motivator for me is my daughter. I've been lucky enough to have a 7-year-old daughter. She turns 8 a week after the election, which is quite exciting for her. She's already planning everything out. And look, I think through our children, we recognise that there is an enormous degree of optimism for the future, but also you feel a lot of pressure to make sure that you have a future for them. And I think this is what leads me to my candidacy. I see our state as being fundamentally broken. We have a situation where we have enormous levels of homelessness and disadvantage, often supported, I might add, by faith-based institutions such as my neighbours in King's Cross at Wayside Chapel. And it has been for the wrong reasons. A lot of this is to support developers and people with a lot of money and privilege, and the gambling industry. And it's been very, very sad to see this situation evolve. There are a lot of areas that we're going to touch on later tonight that I think are really, really important for us to be active on. Housing is a huge one, and we are going to discuss that specifically. The situation for renters is absolutely appalling. Housing is essentially cooked. And I think the situation in terms of public housing needs enormous levels of support. Meanwhile, obviously, we're in the middle of a climate crisis, and we need to act very decisively around that if we are going to circumvent that. And of course, gambling. And I think this is something very true to the hearts of those here tonight, that we need to act very decisively on an industry that at the moment has got very much out of control. So those are some of the things that motivate me. Another area that motivates me a lot is actually fact about addiction and drugs, in that I've had very personal experience in my own family around these areas, and I've been dismayed to see a government, dismayed to see a government that is focused around these being policing issues rather than health issues. Meanwhile, pouring enormous amounts of support into a gambling industry that essentially promotes another form of addiction. So these things are things that can be addressed, and that's what brings me here today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Nick. And Mr Greenwich, our independent sitting member for Parliament, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of our land, the Cathedral people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Alex Greenwich. I'm the current independent member for Sydney. I was elected in 2012 with the endorsement of my predecessor, the Lord Mayor Clover Moore. I grew up in the inner city, and it has been that experience of living in the inner city which has really shaped my politics. It has shaped my support for diverse communities. It has shaped the need for proper housing affordability, including social and affordable housing and support for people experiencing homelessness. And it's also shaped the need for greater public spaces for those inner city communities. Throughout my time in politics, I have obviously championed a number of socially progressive causes that at times have brought me in conflict with churches such as this one or St Mary's and others. But I have always sought to work out where we can find common ground and to work out where we can work together. The last time I was here in this space was right after the Orlando massacre in the Pulse gay nightclub. And it was this church that brought together the faith community, the political community, and the LGBTI community to send a strong sign of solidarity with those who had lost their lives and those who had lost loved ones in that cruel attack in the US. Indeed, I recently worked with Reverend Fred Nile on legislation to protect Aboriginal cultural heritage items. And most recently, I've obviously been working closely with Wesley Mission, and it's great to see Sue Cameron here, to really push both major parties when it comes to gambling reform in this state, something that is long overdue. It was my amendments that put cashless gaming in the casinos within 2 years when we were dealing with the Casino Control Act. And I have committed to pursuing cashless gaming through my own legislation in the next term of Parliament. We know the Coalition has that policy, but should the Coalition not win, I will progress that and build support with whoever forms government and in whatever shape they form government. I also work very closely with the City of Sydney and others to support the great work that Hammond Care does. That is an aged care home for people who are or have been experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. That was a really powerful moment, because what we saw with the opening of Hammond Care in Darlinghurst was the various sides that funded the Yes or the No campaign for marriage equality coming together and putting funds for that. It was the City of Sydney, the Snow Foundation, and the Sydney Anglican Diocese, which contributed a significant amount to make that space happen. So although we have had our policy disputes, particularly most recently on voluntary assisted dying, but also on the decriminalisation of abortion, marriage equality and other LGBTI causes which I'll continue to champion, I just want to assure you that I will always work in a respectful way with faith groups. I will always listen. I will always be open to amendment and to policies being informed. And I will always be open, my door will always be open to all of the religious groups within the Sydney electorate. For the record, I do support protecting religion as a protected attribute in the Anti-Discrimination Act, and have also supported legislation to prevent religious vilification. I find that we work better when we work together, when we find commonality, and when we end discrimination against all people, whether they be people of faith or whether they be the LGBTI community or cold communities. So my commitment to you is, although we will come in conflict again, it is through that conflict that we will have good conversations, and it is through those conversations that we will make our city a fairer and more equal place for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all three candidates. And I forgot to say at the start, I have some chockies, and to say thank you for your efforts. And actually, a little note, we prayed for you, and I assure you, as no doubt you often assured by Christians in the cities, that we pray for you weekly, those in public life. What do we mean when we say we pray for you? A little something I say that. I'm going to give it to you now because I know Mr. Greenwich does have to go before the end of the night, so I thought that's the best way to do it. And while I do that, let's have our first video, which is raising the topic that has been mentioned, I think, by all three speakers, that of of housing affordability, renting and related issues. Thank you.
If you want to change someone's life, give them housing. Give them housing that is secure and that is affordable.
So I'm lucky I got this place. It's like a godsend for me. It's like I said, and when I say it saved my life, I really mean it, it saved my life.
This is a really important state election for affordable housing. Our research shows that if you're a single income household or on welfare, there's nothing available in the private rental market right now.
Churches have a unique role to play in providing housing. We have so much. God has blessed us with so much rich property resource. How do we unlock the potential of that?
There is a human face to the suffering of the housing crisis in our backyard. We ask all candidates to commit to the following 4 solutions, a consensus from across the faith sector in New South Wales. First, to commit to scale up housing supply and invest in an immediate and sustained increase in the supply of social and affordable rental housing.
Second, to ensure extended tenant support and invest in expanded and sustained wraparound support services.
Third, to establish a New South Wales state government-led integrated planning pathway to accelerate and sustain housing development.
Fourth, for a move from no grounds evictions to reasonable grounds evictions, for fair limits on rental increases. rental standards for people living with a disability, and climate readiness, including energy efficiency.
So our questions for our candidates now, and perhaps we go in reverse order this time. How would you invest in social and affordable housing and particularly support renters with respect to no grounds evictions and rent increases? Thanks, Mr. Granish.
Thank you very much for that question and for that video, which really outlined the crisis we are facing. And I support all of those asks that were outlined in that video. I can assure you of that, and will campaign to see those achieved in the next term of Parliament. I also am on the record as supporting a end of no-fault evictions in New South Wales, and have supported Greens legislation as a matter of urgency for our state to pass the Parliament. Unfortunately, that didn't succeed, but it is great that we now have that support from the major parties, and that has to be one of the first pieces of legislation that we deal with in the next term of Parliament. We also need a massive increase in both social and affordable housing, particularly in the inner city. When I first got elected in 2012, I fought hard to save as much of the social housing in Millers Point as possible. We were only able to save 30 dwellings there, but we have managed to protect other social housing within the electorate. But just protecting what we've got is not good enough. We need to be building more, and we need to be having clear targets on new developments to include more social and affordable housing. Importantly, we need to be supporting the services, many of them faith-based services, as Nick said, who are doing the amazing work in providing those wraparound services to people to ensure that we're able to get people the right housing they need. You know, someone who's been a rough sleeper, a social housing property may be appropriate for them. Being able to put them in the private rental market may, you know, in a small number of cases work. They may need to go to aged care, to a place like Hammond Care, or they may need more intensive services, particularly around drug and alcohol. So we need to make sure that those services are properly funded. So my commitment is to absolutely continuing to champion this in the New South Wales Parliament, and to make sure that those vulnerable communities have a voice on our floor.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I don't know that there'd be many areas which would be a better fit like a glove than this area for Greens. Our policies in this area are extensive. It would take me more than 2 minutes to go through them. And as Alex has referenced, our track record in this area is also really extensive. We have plans around how to address the shortage of public housing and social and affordable housing, and they're very detailed plans. We have a policy around addressing the appalling situation that renters find themselves in during a period of terrible cost of living increases, where we're seeing, just the other day I talked to someone who had had a 25% rent increase being thrust upon them at a time when they are least able to afford it. So we are proposing some very concrete policies here. We're proposing rent freezes during this period of terrible out of control cost of living. We're proposing enormous investments in public housing and affordable housing. I have spoken extensively with some of our friends in the Northcote Towers in Surrey Hills who are going through terrible experiences, and indeed part of their pain is around maintenance not being provided to them. They have leaks that haven't been fixed in 12 months, and they've got mould throughout their entire apartments, and they keep ringing up and get told that someone will come out at some point in time. It's an appalling situation. It's been allowed to happen, I have to say, under this current government, and as Greens we will work with others in the Parliament to make sure that this is addressed.
I agree that I believe, especially when it comes to public housing, the lack of maintenance is by design, and we need to fix that. I've been to Northcote Towers, Waterloo Towers. I've also been to Matthew Talbot, and this week in Surrey Hills went to the Salvation Army housing groups directly for men and directly for women, and we need change in those areas immediately. We need more funding, we need more investment, we need to secure more social and affordable housing just in terms of builds builds and maintenance. The Labor Party has committed to 30% of government surplus land to be dedicated to social and affordable housing. When it comes to public housing, we are going to streamline the archaic system that you currently have to create Homes New South Wales. That will combine Aboriginal housing, Land and Housing Corporation, and also there is one that's just slipped my mind just then. But the whole aim of that is to ensure that people who are going through distressed times have one agency, have one body to go through, and are not just getting passed around from person to person as if, you know, their livelihood doesn't matter. When it comes to renting, something that I'm incredibly passionate about, I'm a renter. I've always been a renter. The majority of Sydney are renters. If my rent goes up like everyone else has in the last 12 months, I won't be able to stay here. And it is absurd, and that's why, straight off the bat, Labor has committed to ban no grounds evictions. We're going to end secret rent bidding. We're going to make it easier to have pets in rentals because we know they're like family. But most importantly, we're going to establish the Rental Commissioner. Now, the sole purpose of the Rental Commissioner is to focus on renters' rights. As a priority, I want them to focus on more supply in the rental market and introducing control measures for unfair rent increases. I want to look at models such as they're doing in New York and even the ACT of rent controls and rent capping, where at that point you sign on to a lease after 12 months. If the CPI is here, your rent will increase by 1.5 XYZ%. Therefore, there's no arbitrary figure. We know what is happening, and we know that we are also in tandem able to work with people who are dealing with the interest rate rises who may own these properties. And in the video that came up earlier, I heard, you know, streamlines in terms of planning. We are going to establish a planning minister, again, like Homes New South Wales, to streamline everything through one process, to cut as much red tape as possible, to ensure that we can have as many builds as quickly as we can. So, yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Now, I'm conscious of the time. One more? Time for one more? Okay. Thanks, Mr. Greenwich. Let's have the next video then.
I'm Tom Eastlake, and I'm a Christian special religious or education or an SRE teacher in a New South Wales public school. And I'm also a representative of the Interchurch Commission for Religious Education in Schools. In recognition of the benefit of SRE to both students and broader society, the opportunity to opt into SRE classes in New South Wales in public schools is supported by not just the majority of the public, but also both sides of New South Wales Parliament. SRE supports multiculturalism, it counters religious bullying, it supports cultural and religious identity, and it supports a student's spiritual well-being, which is one of the 5 pillars that the Department of Education has identified as critical to a student's ability to connect, succeed, and thrive. But to support the continuation of SRE, we're asking for your help. Historically, the school enrolment form has included a question on religious identity, but this has been removed. This question existed to allow both the Department of Education and the SRE community to do the same thing as an enrolment question does about a student's learning needs or their medical history, and that's what that seeks to do today. It allows the school and the SRE community to deploy resources to ensure that a student's well-being, their spiritual well-being, is supported in line with the well-being framework for schools. This, vitally, helps the Department of Education ensure that appropriate resources and care are offered to all students enrolled in public schools in New South Wales. Since this question has been removed from the enrolment form, it has become increasingly difficult to support SRE in schools. The reality is that schools can't host and SRE teachers can't teach classes in schools if they don't know where the students are. So in standing for New South Wales Parliament in 2023, our question is, are you willing to confirm your support for SRE and commit to seeing the reintroduction of the religious identity question to the school enrolment form?
Do you want me to repeat the question? No, I've got it.
Thank you. And again, I apologise that I'll have to leave early tonight, but I do commit to answering all the remaining questions, and I will send them through to St Andrews, who can publish them in whatever format they feel is appropriate. Look, when it comes to special religious education in schools, I think this should be an option that is open to students. I support the continuation of it as an option for students. When it comes to the question of what your religion is, look, I think we need to consider this as an optional question. It may be that there are some families or some communities who do not want to provide this information. We know the statistical data is there from a recent census as well, so we're able to know what faith groups people are in what areas, and what faith groups need to be catered for by those various schools. But I wouldn't want to see a situation in a school where people are in any way targeted or bullied because they are of a certain faith or because they are not a person of faith. So I think if there is a way to have this as an option for families, parents and students, then that is something that should be considered. I don't support it as a mandatory question that needs to be answered by all students. And thank you all, and I wish you a good night and good deliberations ahead of your voting on the 25th of March. Thank you.
New South Wales supports SRE. As Alex mentioned, I believe that it should be there for an option. And especially when it comes to our public education, there may be families that wish to send their child to a faith-based education, but it's simply not financially viable. So we want to ensure that our public education reflects the diversity of our community. As Alex also said, I believe that it should be there as an option and work in tandem with other services that schools provide, such as school counselling, which I think is imperative as well. When it comes to having the question upon enrolment, I don't believe that it's necessary. I think that if it is a service that is to be sought out, it is something that can be dealt with the parents, with the students, with the staff of the school or the educational institution that they're going to. I do not believe that it is mandatory.
Thanks, Skye, and thanks for the question. Look, I want to start by saying that I think it is really important that we support the right of people of faith to practice their religion and practice it without discrimination. And as part of that, I think religion has played a very important role culturally and historically in forming the world that we have today, and to actually view what place religion, all religions have played in that path is actually quite a useful thing for people to learn in schools. It is, however, I think a different question that's being asked here, which is around scriptures education, and that is around probably a specific education on the religion of that particular school. Now, I work with a lot of faith-based schools. I work with a lot of schools, and I would say that the resources currently available to go and for teachers to be able to deliver the high quality education that they're committed to are very, very limited. And as a result of that, I think the ability, I mean, we do have Sunday schools, and certainly those are places where scriptures education is executed. In our publicly funded faith or non-faith based schools, I think our focus needs to be very much on our on the curriculum, if you like. I also will take the point that as a gay man, I've met many other gay men who have gone through the school system and have been bullied terribly, and in many cases, and this is not fair, but in many cases this has been in the name of some of the scriptures that have been taught in those very schools. And that's an appalling situation and has seen those people scarred for life. When it comes to the religion question on an enrolment form, this is a dangerous area I see, because you can see faith-based schools potentially, and I'm not pointing a finger at all faith-based schools, selecting or not selecting a child on the basis of the religion that is put on an enrolment form. And a lot of our faith-based schools are the best education that is available, particularly in rural and regional areas. And I'd hate to see a situation where a child was not given the best opportunity to reach their full potential because of the religion that was or wasn't put on one of these forms.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Skye. And I think I have an apology that the question could have been slightly sharper by adding the word public before schools, with special reference to public schools. But Thank you for your answers. And I think I'll add another word of apology. Not that I can really apologise for everyone, but I think absolutely agree it's terrible that any child should be bullied because of their own sexual identity or their parents' sexual identity or family situation or appearance or religion or anything like that. And I'm deeply grieved when I hear people who have done that and have claimed some kind of covering from God. That grieves me deeply. Even where we disagree on other things, there's no excuse for bullying. Our third question then is one that's been very dear to my heart for over a decade, more than that since I became aware of the pastoral impact on people in my congregations. So let's see that now.
Hi, I'm Reverend Stu Cameron from Wesley Mission. Did you know that Australians lose $25 billion each year through gambling, and half of the total losses are through poker machines? Australia is home to nearly 80% of the world's pub and club poker machines. The problem is worse than New South Wales. New South Wales could be dubbed the pokey state. New South Wales is home to almost half of the poker machines in Australia, just over 86,000 in pubs and clubs and 1,500 at the start. In the last 30 years, people across New South Wales have lost $135 billion through poker machines. The most recent data available shows that between July and September 2022, people across New South Wales lost more than $2 billion to poker machines in pubs and clubs. Gambling doesn't just affect an individual person alone, but every person impacted, 5 to 10 others are also harmed. Harm to relationships, health and psychological well-being are some of the most common impacts. The highest at-risk groups of people that we connect with at Wesley Mission are those who have experienced trauma, where gambling becomes an outlet for overwhelming emotions, compounding the harm caused. But change is coming. Between royal commissions and inquiries into casinos, the New South Wales Crime Commission's recent investigation into money laundering in pubs and clubs, and federally, inquiries into online gambling and its impacts on people experiencing gambling harm, we're at a tipping point in Australia. Poker machine reform and a cashless gambling card are now key election issues in the lead up to the New South Wales state election on March 25. And you can join us in addressing gambling harm as we put pokies in their place.
So we have a kind of specific question and a more general question. The specific question is, what is your party's response to the Crime Commission's recommendation for a universal cashless gaming card on poker machines? And the more general question is, what is your party going to do to address the epidemic of gambling harm in New South Wales?
Thank you. And I would like to start by recognising the wonderful work that the Wesley Mission has done in this space. It is fallen, sadly, to many of our churches and our faith-based organisations to manage the terrible harm that is happening in this area. As a part of being a candidate in an election, you end up out at a lot of places out in the community talking to people, understanding what are the issues that are passionate for those people. And I have to say, one of the real head turners has been the issues of pokies. When we have gone and raised that we want to remove pokies from clubs and pubs, that has stopped people who otherwise would have continued along their way and come back and say, what did you say? Yes, and then relate a story that they have personal experience with in their own families in most of those cases. So the Greens have some very, very specific responses around the Commission's reports and around this area. We have a plan to phase out pokies from pubs within 5 years and from clubs within 10 years. And in the interim, to have cashless gaming across all pubs and clubs. We want to put $1 bet limits on all of the gambling that goes on, to have curfews between midnight and midday, and to stop the kind of pro-addiction advertising and dynamics that happen around gambling within these environments to avoid people ending up in this scourge of gambling harm. I want to draw a picture of you of where this addiction that clubs and pubs have to gambling could be reshaped and go in a different direction. We could have live music, theatre, other entertainment come back to our pubs and clubs and have an enormous amount more life in our community by removing the so-called VIP lounges from these institutions. There's a real opportunity for us, I think, at this election to make an enormous difference in this space, and the firmer that we are in demanding change here, the more likely we are to achieve it.
I think the report that was handed down by the Criminal Commission was awful, and we need to act on this matter with a level of urgency and with strong investment. Now, New South Wales Labor has a plan, we have a timeline, and we have allocated funds to be able to implement that with urgency. But what we are trialling, or what we want to implement, is a trial period that will commence as of the 1st of July for 12 months for cashless gaming across the state that will be monitored by an independent panel. We want to do this right, and we want to do this once. We want to ensure that we are creating good legislation from across the state, and we factor in the regional and rural areas. We know that Sydney is highly dented when it comes to pokie machines, and we see all those awful VIP signages across all of our streets, which is also something that New South Wales Labor wants to ban, which is the external signage. But we do want to make sure that we do this properly and once, and that the 172,000 people employed in this industry have a transitional phase to ensure that they can go off and they can secure work. But I think many people have been personally touched by a story by someone who has had a gambling addiction, or have seen it firsthand, or have been within close proximity, and you know how toxic it is, and you know just how overwhelming it is, and that's why we do need to address this issue with a level of seriousness and, as I keep saying, with urgency. My mother was a bartender at Bankstown RSL when she had me. I was working in King's Cross Hotel a couple of years ago, and within that 30 years gap, not much has changed, or 29 years gap, not much has changed, just in terms of a lot of the problematic patrons being from that area. So overall, we are also going to establish gaming officers. Now, the gaming officers will be similar to people who have RCGs, but they will be patrolling pokey areas of any venue that has over 20 pokies. As I also mentioned, we will get rid of that external signage. We've also banned political donations from clubs, and we've already done that, so that is irrespective of whether we form government come March, because those sorts of players should not be pulling any political levers.
I'm trying not to editorialise too much, but I'll just agree with Stu Cameron, my good friend, and say change is coming, and the more the better. We have one last set-piece question before it's your chance, but you've been able to see the Slido thing all along, and there should be time for a couple more questions if something's on your mind. But this last question is kind of in the area of religious freedom, and so let's see that last video.
Religious people and organisations have long played a crucial role in our communities. A large proportion of our education, health and social services are provided by faith-based organisations, and nearly all of Australia's largest charities have Christian roots. People of faith continue to contribute to our society's welfare because of their religious values, and governments recognise their contributions by partnering with them to deliver important services. This is now under threat from new laws that undermine the very heart and soul of faith-based organisations. As a result of recent amendments to anti-discrimination law in various states, faith-based organisations such as churches, synagogues, mosques, religious schools, charities and aged care can no longer insist that their staff adhere to or model their religious beliefs and values. At the federal level, the recent Australian Law Reform Commission consultation paper, issued at the request of the Labor government, escalates this threat. This strikes at the heart of a religious organisation's ability to preserve their ethos and effectively carry out their religious mission in service to their communities, and is a huge blow to both religious freedom and freedom of association. This is happening despite a growing awareness of people being seriously mistreated because of their religion, and the wide consensus that religious freedom is vital and needs to be protected. While it is right and proper to protect individuals from unjust discrimination, these new laws fail to get the balance right between the freedom of people of faith to operate faith-based institutions and the freedom of individuals who do not support that faith. And it is not hard to get the balance right. The Commonwealth Religious Discrimination Bill had bipartisan support on this issue, and the New South Wales Religious Freedoms and Equality Bill had the support of a bipartisan Joint Select Committee. Each of these had sensible mechanisms that provided robust protection against religious discrimination for individuals, while at the same time recognising that it was not discriminatory for religious bodies to operate in accordance with their religious beliefs. We allow other groups formed around a set of values, such as unions and political parties, to employ people who agree with their beliefs and ethos, but are now at risk of denying the same right to faith-based organisations. This state election, ask your candidates, will you support legislation that both protects religious individuals from discrimination while also protecting the freedom of religious bodies to operate in accordance with their values and to preference staff who align with them?
So I think when it comes to the New South Wales Religious Discrimination Act that was established in 1977, and I think it needs to be reviewed, and I think it needs to be contemporised with the current modern society that we're in now. But about that process, I think that is what is crucial. Now, I think that this is an incredibly serious and incredibly sensitive area, so we need to make sure that that consultation process is thorough, is transparent, and has a diverse group that is feeding into this to ensure that we strike the right balance. Now, I believe that when you are going to, reach out to a religious service or institution, that people should be able to receive that service or that spiritual guidance with someone that they resonate with on that journey, but never at the cost of discrimination, never at the cost of the detriment of someone else's well-being, no matter what identifying factor that is. That is just non-negotiable.
I want to actually congratulate my friends and family who are people of faith and recognise the enormous values that those faiths in those people actually support. They're important values such as reliability, honesty, caring and so on. In employment, you can absolutely employ on the basis of relevant values and qualifications that a person has, and that exists and will continue to exist. Anti-discrimination legislation does not stop you from demanding that a person is caring, that a person is honest, and there are a range of values which are very important in employment. Meanwhile, there are some roles where religious affiliation probably is actually relevant and a legitimate area for employment. If you were, for instance, a priest or someone who was actually preaching that religion, a lived experience in that religion might be quite relevant. Where I think, and there was discussion in the video about balance, where I think the balance is getting wrong, I can illustrate by a person I've met through my work, who for this purpose I'm going to call Mark. And I was having a coffee with Mark, and he is at an Anglican school in his area, which is a regional area, and he outlined the situation that it was coming towards the end of his natural time within that school, and he wanted to move to different schools. But he said that, however, he knew he couldn't, and I was curious about that and said, oh, why is that the case? And he said, well, all of the schools in my area are Christian schools, are schools of different areas of the Christian faith to the Anglican area he was from. This man is an IT teacher. He's not an IT teacher, he's actually an IT technician. He works in IT. And I must say, somewhat gobsmacked that he may be in a situation where he either has to stay in a job he no longer enjoys or not be able to provide food and shelter for his wife and children. And I think this is where it's important to balance this situation really, really carefully. There are legitimate reasons for being able to preference a person in employment, and they are protected. But the actual membership or affiliation to a religion are often not what you're really looking for. You're looking for values, and values are absolutely relevant and protected under anti-discrimination law.
Well, thank you both. It's hard work, and it's probably only going to get harder because these now are the questions that have come from the floor and that you don't have notice of. There are little bottles of water if you need a refreshment. It's my duty to manage the questions, and the question that has received the most support for answering is one that, because the member for Sydney has had to leave, I think I'm just going to read the question, and a bit like Tony Jones on Q&A used to say, I'm going to say I'll take that as a statement because it directs to Mr Greenwich in particular, and he can't respond, and I'll let him know that it was asked. He said, the question says, since 2019, the aggregate number of public houses in Sydney has decreased by 400 units. How can we trust the member for Sydney if this is the track record? And I guess my reason for not exploring that question further, of course, is that the member for Sydney isn't the government, as it hasn't been the government in that period. So the question can stand, but I think that's probably fair. So, yeah. Thanks for your grace. So next I've got, what have we got here? Your stance, what is your stance on the privatisation of public services? Too much has been privatised in the last 10 years.
I wholeheartedly agree. In the beginning of my speech, when I said public schools, public hospitals, public services need to work for the public, one way that we ensure that that doesn't happen, that we ensure that we do that, is by stopping privatisation. New South Wales Labor has unequivocally ruled out any further privatisation. We will not privatise Sydney Water. We will not privatise any more of our current public energy streams. And we will, once all of the public transport contracts that have been sold off to Transdev wrap up in 2030, we will fight incredibly hard to ensure that those contracts are held back into public hands.
I saw some statistics the other day which talked about what have been the biggest contributors to inflation we're experiencing and the increased cost of living. And I thought it's probably going to come out that it's the war in Ukraine, or it's around just generally increasing cost of power prices. But it wasn't. It was the increase in profits that are being taken by the private sector throughout a period where we are going through enormous pain as the cost of living increases. Now, I've worked most of my career, not all, but most of my career in the private sector, so I'm certainly not going to put out that the private areas are demonic or are problematic in their own essence. They're not. But we actually can do some amazing things in the private sector, in the public sector, by keeping it public. If you look at what happened in the North Sea when the oil fields were discovered there, not that I generally as a Green talk a lot about the exploitation of oil in an area, but I will here, and Norway and Britain had equal opportunity to have a share of that. In Britain they privatised it, in Norway they kept it public. I probably don't need to explain how those two countries have evolved in terms of their economy. When you get public management of things right, you can get enormous benefits to the community. We shouldn't just be privatising and stopping the privatisation of some of our utilities and services. We should look at the ones that have currently been privatised and bring them back. Our buses in Western Sydney, many of those bus lines have been privatised. They need to come back into it's public transport. It's called public transport for a reason. It needs to come back into public hands. There are a lot of areas there where we could do some fantastic things and save a lot of money for the community while providing better services by deprivatising many areas within our community.
Okay. Thank you both. And the next one says, if a bill banning conversion therapy is introduced, would you protect consensual pastoral care, for example, prayer for those wanting to live in accordance with their faith? Do you want me to say that again? Is it clear? Yep. So consensual pastoral care.
Now, this is a cracker of a question, and we were discussing this the other day, and it is a very, very interesting one, because certainly my position on people who are who have been terribly damaged by conversion therapy and are too young to give their true consent, or don't give their consent and have it forced on them is fairly obvious. I have to say, as a gay man, that there was a period in my life I would have loved to have not been gay. I don't know that I would have said yes for whatever reason. I would like to go through a process which involves electroshock therapy and aversion therapies of various forms to have not been gay. But I would question whether in the environment I found myself, and I think a lot of people of faith find themselves in an environment where they can't see a way forward to retain the love of the people who are very important with them and be their true selves. The question comes to me of whether consent is true consent at that point in time to go through this situation. Now, bearing in mind the question actually talked about pastoral support, but when it comes to things like aversion therapy, it's a very, very serious issue. And so I have to say from my own position, I struggle to see a situation where I would support this kind of intervention over a person's sexuality in the same way as an intervention over a person's race or religion or anything else. I can't see a situation where I'd support it.
I'm not too sure if the people at home could see me, but I was obviously just very confused and I was trying to process the question, because in my position I want to make very clear that I wholeheartedly support banning conversion therapy, and as someone who hasn't had to go through that experience of being unsure of whether or not a religious body should intervene, if someone who has grown up in a religious space or in a religious background and has found themselves who is proudly part of the queer community, and they are trying to figure out who they are, I don't think it would be beneficial for there to be intervention, because if this is someone who is trying to step away from the faith to understand who they are, I couldn't see how intervention at that point would be beneficial. If it is consent and if someone is trying to understand who they are in tandem with their religious beliefs, most definitely, but I think that that would be a case-by-case basis, but I don't think that that should be the first port of call for someone who is trying to figure out who they are and be proud of who they are and have that sort of intervention, because I think at that point, when you have been brought up a certain way and when you understand the world for what it is very confusing to try and work your way out of it. So I do believe if someone decides to step away, that there shouldn't be intervention.
Thank you again for giving clear answers, I think. The next question, Sky, I think this one's just for you. Why does Labor insist on plans for a trial of cashless gaming cards when when every other party and experts say it's the right move? Why did its plan take so long? Tough one?
No, I completely understand. These are a lot of the frustrations that I've dealt with on the ground while talking to people across the last few months. As I mentioned earlier, we do want to ensure that we do it once and we get it right. So there have been, in terms of research, there has been some preliminary studies and trials that has happened in Victoria that has shown, because that unfortunately a cashless gaming card can sometimes feel like just a game card, as if you're in time zone or something or other. So people have ended up spending more money because they do not physically see the money filtering in through the machines. We also want to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences, and we get it right straight off the bat, because when we are introducing new technology, third-party technology, we want to make sure that everything is correct, everything is above board, and when it comes to any sort of data breaches, when we are extracting that much personal information, that we have it right and that we haven't rushed into the system. And that's what I believe that our trial will allow us to do, and also the 172 workers in the industry that I mentioned before. But we do have our timeline. We do have 100 million dedicated to this because we know how important it is. And I hear those frustrations. I know a lot of people have actually said to me, it's just not good enough. I've had a lot of researchers and people that come from academic backgrounds say to me, it's just not good enough. I do believe in the trial process to ensure we do it once and we do it firm and we do it right.
Okay, we've had quite a few policy questions. I think this is kind of a character and good process question. Integrity in politics is important. What will you do if elected to maintain integrity in your office?
I think integrity is just paramount to who people are as a person. I think integrity is not something that you can teach. I think that it is something that it is within you, and you just ensure that you abide by it. In terms of integrity, when I talk about my work experience and when I talk about the private sector, I worked in property development for almost 9 years. And a lot of people, when they hear that, they hear a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, and I get it. I never thought I was going to end up in the development industry. I was a high school dropout, came back, repeated, and then when I left school, I just needed a job, and that's how I ended up staying within that field for the last 9 years. I didn't have a financial or educational backing, so I had to stay in the right place. It was not the right place. I had to stay in the same place to get runs on the board. Why I bring that up in terms of integrity? Because in that field and in that space, there is a lot of crossover when it comes to government. There is a lot of crossover when it comes to working on billion-dollar projects. And time again, I've witnessed firsthand people just throw away their integrity for a deal, for a job, for a promotion, and just with the way that I was brought up, I need to be able to look people in the eye. It's the same way that when people ask me, what are you going to do after the election if you're not elected? I'm going to stay around, I'm going to stay present in the community, I'm going to fight for better housing rights, I'm going to make sure that our public systems work, because that's what I campaigned on relentlessly for the last 4.5 months. And just in terms of integrity, I need to make sure that I can look people in the eye when I said that I was going to do what I was going to do, irrespective.
I see two angles or two directions that this question needs to be answered on. The first is a personal direction, and I would say to anyone looking to get into the political sphere, what is motivating you to do this? Is it career, or is it around the community and trying to be driven to actually change things for the better? I would say the first question that one needs to honestly answer is around that question. The second part of this is to understand that some people seem to be very tempted by some of the mechanisms that have now become very common within Australian politics. And I would say Australian politics even more so than many overseas jurisdictions. And that is an environment of rampant political donations, where the success and the survival in many cases of political interests revolves around accepting money from large interests, big developers, big corporations, and to then go and say, well, we have integrity, we're not going to let that influence us, is, I'm sorry, rather naive. Those donations are being given with the expectation that it may make some of the decisions move more towards a particular direction. So I think part of it is a personal question and ensuring that people do enter politics for the right reasons. The second part of it, I think, is we need to specifically tackle donations and the structure by which we see our political system dominated by not politicians and not the community, but big interests in media and in corporations.
Okie dokes. I think I'll ask this one next. What are your plans for better public transport in Sydney, especially for the elderly and those with disabilities?
Yeah, I better not give Sky the job of going and having to think it through on the run all the time. We'll just do most of the time. And look, public transport is an area, those who know me know how passionate I am about public transport. I made the decision some years ago to not continue to own a car, and I do a lot of walking, I do a lot of cycling, but I do an enormous amount of public transport as well. And I think the unfortunate situation we have found ourselves in this state is that public transport has been seen as a cost that governments need to deal with rather than a service that a government needs to provide to enable the community to be at its best. That service has been minimised in terms of those costs. It's been privatised in terms of trying to turn it into an opportunity for people to make lots of money out of. And when you view it through either of those lenses, the needs of people who are differently abled or have specific needs, who are elderly, the needs that are required to have a public transport that serves the community rather than vice versa are often neglected, because in a commercial model you want to keep your costs down and you want to make your revenue as high as possible. If we think about where the Greens policy lies, one of the barriers that we wish to take away in public transport is the cost of public transport to the user and make public transport free. And before we all gasp at how ridiculous that sounds, we currently pay 80% of the cost of public transport. If we pick up the other 20% of the cost of public transport and no longer need ticket inspectors and machines to go and collect fares, we get the extra enablement to our economy by having people able to move around more freely. They can go shopping in the city without any financial barriers to do so, and they can move around to healthcare and education, again, with no financial barriers, particularly for those who are less well off. Just think about the benefits that could come to the community out of that. So, in summary, I'm a very strong supporter of public transport. I think we can get this right, and our Greens policies would send us very much on the line to doing that. Yeah, sure.
Labor has committed to substantial investment in terms of upgrading our public transport to ensure its accessibility. One of the stations that I know personally is Macquarie Field Station, which I believe is where they did the announcement. This is out in southwest Sydney. There are no lifts there. So if you have a pram, if you are in a wheelchair, or if you have any sort of mobility issues, you are actually unable to adequately access this platform in this train station. Labor has committed substantial financial commitments to be able to upgrade many of our train platforms. In terms of our buses especially, we are fighting hard to ensure that after the privatisation they come back into public hands. One of the most recent situations that I've been in is that in the Pyrmont bus services they have taken out some crucial stops on the 389. This is horrific for a lot of people, especially people with mobility issues. They can't walk that far. That you cannot ask someone in the heat, in the rain, to walk those distances, let alone if they have pre-existing mobility issues. very, very quick anecdote. Last year I ended up in hospital with a spinal infection. I couldn't walk properly for the following month, and it really made me look at the world a lot more differently. I know that we shouldn't have to have personal experiences to be able to put ourselves into perspective, but I think when it comes to public transport, when it comes to new buildings, new developments, we need to ensure that accessibility is at the forefront of everything that we design or everything that we upgrade.
That's just really fascinating. Thank you both for keeping on giving. I've got one that's off the books that someone knew how to get to me another way, and it also takes us outside of Sydney, but it's the state parliament that you would be elected to, and it's a question of what would your policy be about the feral horses in the snowy mountains?
Indeed, this has been actually a really interesting part of the campaign. We've had some very direct questions on invasive species, and this is an invasive species. I will, in recognition of the earlier statement, try and keep this very brief, but I will go and say that we are supportive of removing invasive species wherever they are. They are doing, the horses in the snowy mountains, as much as they may look great on a movie, are doing enormous damage to the environment in that area, and we would support removing them.
I'm just going to straight up say that I do not have an adequate response to that. So unfortunately, if it is an invasive species, that would be something I would be happy to defer to our relevant shadow minister and come back. I'm not going to try and pretend like I know everything when I don't.
Thank you both. Greens not forced to keep employing someone who starts promoting coal. ALP not forced to employ someone anti-unions. Same privilege for faith groups too.
I understand, that analogy that has been put forward, and that's why I believe that it is incredibly nuanced. It is a case-by-case basis, and as I mentioned, when I do believe that we need to review the Anti-Discrimination Act and update it in our current contemporary, but ensure the level of diversity, because we want to make sure that when it comes to religious-based services or institutions, that people who are reaching out to access these services or to go to these institutions are getting the direct care that they need and are getting help with someone who resonates with their spiritual journey, but it is incredibly nuanced, and I'm just sorry that it cannot be blanketed.
I mean, the simple answer to this is we actually employ a lot of people who have very, very different views on many of the things which in many cases are core policies of the Greens. In fact, the Greens, if I ever invited you to a state delegates conference, you will find an enormous variety of opinions there on multitude of issues. So we do absolutely encourage a difference of thought, and we don't just employ in any of the structures on a person's beliefs. If there was a person who was taking on a role within the Greens where a certain degree of lived experience or knowledge, and that could only come from, that particular experience, okay, that might be a different scenario. But I would say I'd encourage everyone here who has a different opinion to what we have talked about tonight, please come and join the Greens. We love to have that breadth and diversity of opinion within our organisation.
Okay, topic we haven't covered yet tonight. What support will you give to increase funding to palliative care, especially with euthanasia putting a quiet pressure on people to choose that option?
I believe that we do need to fund our palliative care adequately, and with the introduction of euthanasia, ensure that we do have adequate funding to attend to those needs for people if that is a service that they would require for themselves or their loved ones.
This is a really great question, and I think it is really important that people understand that voluntary assisted dying is very much driven through a process where the reasons for people's own life decisions are taken very carefully. A lack of adequate palliative care being available, I struggle to believe that that's ever going to be a situation which is going to see someone elect to go and take the assisted dying path. One of my best friends was unfortunately suffering from terminal cancer 2 years ago, and I saw the situation where he was a scientist. He knew exactly where his liver and brain cancer was going to evolve, and as it took that path, he was actually one of the first people in Victoria to take the path of voluntary assisted dying, and I saw him being able to actually live in a lot less pain in the thought that he would go along a path that was one he was very familiar with from his own background, and that he could actually have control in that last period. And so, yes, of course there should be adequate funding for palliative care, as in all of our healthcare areas, and we need to make sure that we have a free, universal, high-quality healthcare system in all aspects. And when it comes to voluntary assisted dying, I think it's important that we don't find that as a path that is driven by a lack of adequate palliative care, and I don't believe that's currently the case.
Now, once again, Sky and Nick, thank you for just keeping on. You're really working hard for us tonight, so thank you for that. Are ethics courses as valuable to a child's education as religious instruction? Any thoughts? It may refer to... why don't I make a... Yeah. I don't know, but it may refer to in public schools, in the special religious education time slot, there is also provision made for special education in ethics as another option. It may be your question is referring specifically to that matter or just more broadly. So I guess you take it as you want, but are ethics courses as valuable to a child's education as religious instruction?
So my interpretation of this question, and my apologies to the person who was asked this in case I get it wrong, is that an ethics course and special religious education are seen as two separate things. And if we're talking about an ethics, and what I kind of mentioned earlier, that in my personal belief that integrity comes from within, I think we actually can work it into the curriculum. And when we speak about ethics courses, about kindness, compassion, caring, and I know that a lot of these emulate what religion is about and what is discussed and spoken about and what is heavily believed in these realms. So, and I could be getting this question wrong, if a person or if a family decides that special religious education is for them and that is a path and a journey that they want to pursue and it is available to them, in which it should be, because I just want to be able to diversify our public spaces, definitely. And then if an ethics course works in tandem, or if an ethics course is something that a young person, veers towards instead of special religious education, then I would be for that. I could have got the question wrong, so sorry if I did.
I'm a very strong believer that education is a lot more than reading, writing and arithmetic. And as part of that, ethics and a discussion of society and the values that we hold and are contributing to a more healthy society is a really constructive conversation to have in a classroom. Now, that can be in a religious context, talking about values which are supported by that religion, as many of those values and those ethics are within that framework, and essentially whether it is in the framework of a religion of the faith of that school or in the framework of a non-faith-based structure, I absolutely believe that ethics are well and truly worth having a discussion about as part of an education system.
I'm going to give an apology to our two speakers at the moment. We're getting a bit of passive smoking up the front here. I don't know if you're getting it where you're sitting, but anyhow, apologies. That's must mean there's a breeze out there tonight. Okay, we probably won't get through them all. I think this one is a very practical question. It's not got the most thumbs up, but I'm going to give it a thumbs up myself. Apart from giving government land over to social housing, all policies cost money, millions of dollars. How are you going to pay for these? And yes, that's, I think the reason I wanted to add it is very easy at a forum like tonight to be sort of ready to agree with pretty much anything we ask for, but it's got to be paid for. So how will you pay for your policies?
So when New South Wales puts forward our policies, we ensure that they are feasible and they have a timeline and that they are costed. And that's why when we have committed to our 30% of surplus government land to be dedicated to social and affordable housing, it is because it is within our remit of being able to fund that adequately. When I talked about earlier our policy around our cashless gaming and what we were going to do, and that we had adequately put aside $100 million for that, that money came from the STARS bill. Because of the commission that went into there, they had to pay $100 million to government for all their wrongdoings, and that is the money that we are using for that bill. So when we talk about our policies and all of our different areas, they are funded in different ways. They are funded in different manners and tax, because obviously not every policy is going to be able to be funded by a huge corporation's bill that they had to pay to government for doing the wrong thing. But rest assured that what we do put forward has been costed, because we want to make sure that, yeah, we do not promise the world. We promise what can be done and what is in the best interest of the public.
We are really lucky to be Australian. We are in one of the richest countries in the world, and it really honestly isn't a question of can we afford to pay for things here. It's a question of what do we want to afford to pay for, or what do we want to pay for? Where do we want to take revenue and where do we not want to take it, and what do we want to spend it on? We at the moment collect no royalties and no taxes on any of the oil that is extracted from the North West Shelf. That alone, were we to change our policies in this area, sorry, did I say oil? It was gas, in the North West Shelf. If we were to change our policies in that area, we would have such an injection of revenue into our system that we could pay for education, healthcare and public transport across this country many times over. It's a matter of what we want to actually take as revenue and what we want to spend it on. So we could go through the detailed policies, and I'm happy to share, for instance, our policy around ending gas and coal, and all of that is costed out as to how all of that would be paid for.
I think we've just got time for two more questions, and actually a really interesting one came in just now, which I'll leave as the last one, because I think it's actually just a nice final window for you each to speak to us. So I'm just trying to choose our second last one and trying to pick something that we haven't really covered yet. I'm a bit stumped, aren't I? I could just go for the most popular one, but I think that, well, look, I will. I'll just ask the one that has the most thumbs up remaining. Can Christian organisations teach biblical sexual ethics, their belief that sex is only for a man-woman marriage, without breaking discrimination laws in your government?
When it comes to sexuality and when it comes to religion, my personal view, my personal firm opinion is people should be able to walk this world however they see fit, however they deem themselves to want to be represented, to love whoever they love and to live a life however they lead. When it comes to teaching these religious practices, I understand that by the Bible or by, various other religious material, that is what it states in there. I would be, well, I'm not too sure because I didn't come from a religious background. I didn't go to a religious school. But again, putting it out there as it is said in the Bible, but not dictating that this is right or wrong. Never saying to a young person that how they exist and how they present to the world is right or wrong. Never excluding someone because how they identify or how they operate in life doesn't coincide with what is in these scriptures. I know that these materials exist and they're always going to find themselves in the world, and if people choose to live their life this way, okay, they're going to find it and that material can exist, but just ensuring that the way that it is delivered never makes someone feel as if they're outcast or that they're wrong or that they're different.
I think it's really important to recognise that religions have the freedom to practice that religion, and they have the freedom to, within these magnificent buildings, churches and temples and mosques and so on, to be able to go and communicate the belief set that they work on. I do, however, believe it's very, very important for a consideration of consequence. And so where there are things, as I have seen, unfortunately, in some of my experience with LGBTIQA plus people, there have been some things that have been taught which have actually had consequences, which I believe are unintended consequences. I don't believe that the teachings that were being taught had the intention of the harm that they caused, but they did cause harm. And I think everything that we do need to recognise that, yes, you absolutely have the right to have your beliefs and to preach those beliefs, but you also need to understand consequences and take responsibility for consequences that may flow out of those.
Okay, last one. What's the most significant input you've had to the development of your own worldview? I think that's a great one to finish on, just a little more of yourself. Most significant input to your worldview.
Okay, so when I was 16 years old, unfortunately, my best friend was murdered. At this time, I had left high school. I wasn't in school anymore, but I did the eulogy at his funeral. And when I did the eulogy at his funeral, I thought to myself, what are you doing, Sky? What is your life going to become? If this is the environment that you are around, what is going to happen? So that's why I decided to go back to school, because I thought I wanted to be a journalist. I did not get an ATAR, so I went straight into the workforce and tails back to my journey of working in property development. And it wasn't until after those 9 years that I finally felt as if I had the experience and the networks and the skill set to contribute back where I thought was most important to me. And that's when I thought about when I was 16 years old and I was very lost and very confused and very sad. What do I think would have helped me in that trajectory to set me up for success? And it was education. I decided to go back to high school, and I may have not gone into university and gone through a 10-year process to end up where I have now landed here. But that was the single biggest thing that happened to me, because at the age of 16, I also became acutely aware that unfortunately the world is not a very nice place all the time, and I had to grow up very quickly to understand what was happening around me. It was also heavily publicised on the media and lots of court cases around it, so I think a lot of that has shaped my view about why I think education is so important, and that for anyone at any stage of their lives, you really can set yourself up for success and set yourself for a better trajectory, but that would definitely be it.
I always love it when the most difficult question is left for last. Great question, and can I just take this opportunity to thank everyone who has submitted questions tonight. They've been some fantastic questions, and it's been a real exercise to go through and answer them. I can say a few things that have been heavily influential in my life. I have to say my mother has been incredibly influential. We've talked a lot about values. She was very, very strong about values and always considering what I did and how that impacted those around me, and to be thinking about those around me. the birth of my daughter has to have been an incredibly significant turning point in my life, in that all of a sudden I realised what it was like to have a responsibility over another life and another human being, which is an amazing experience to have. I would say probably one of the most dominant turning points for me was actually at the age of 13, 14, 15, realising that I was different, and that as a straight boy in a very white middle-class household, I wasn't actually in the situation that I thought I was, and I had to do a retake of my own identity, of what can go wrong. And I think the experience for many of us, whatever that experience has been, of where things actually went wrong. With my brother, it was losing a job quite early on. For many, it can be a car accident, or it can be something where all of a sudden everything doesn't go right and you suddenly realise you need to rely upon others and support services. You need to rely on government. It may be becoming unemployed in COVID. It may be COVID. Realising that in actual fact we're a community. We're not a community of individuals, but we are a community and we rely on others, is a really important realisation to have. And I think that's been a turning point in my life, to have that realisation.
A little bit of a theme, I think, we often learn more in the valleys than on the mountaintops, and from experiences of difficulty. Thank you, Sky. Thank you, Nick. And we also are thankful for Mr. Greenwich for the time he was able to give us, for giving of yourselves and for your willingness to serve in public life. I hope you enjoy the chocolates. Freedom for Faith, who gave great assistance just setting up the practicalities of these candidates forums all across Sydney, actually, did organise a brochure about what they consider to be some threats to religious freedom across the nation, only some of which currently apply to New South Wales. If you're interested in the issue of poker machine reform or harm prevention and minimisation, I'd be glad to speak to you afterwards, and so would Stuart. There were a couple more questions, 3 or 4 more questions that we didn't get to, and to those who asked those questions in the Cathedral or at home, I apologise to you. I'll share those questions with our candidates, although it may not be realistic. If we are able to pass on responses, we can. But we managed to cover a remarkable amount of territory tonight. Thank you for your attention at home. I noticed at one point there was around about 20 people, 20 screens watching. Often it's more than one person on a screen. Don't know what the... anyhow, that was up around that kind of number. So I think that without further ado, what I'll do is I'll ask everyone in the Cathedral to stand with me, and a very short prayer of blessing for our nation to conclude. God, bless Australia. Guard our people, guide our leaders, and give us peace. For Jesus Christ's sake, Amen. Would you please show your appreciation for our candidates at the forum tonight? Thank you. I should say, websites aren't hard to find, but if you want to speak to either of the candidates, I'm sure they'll be accessible for a little while longer. Thank you.